Well, thank you very much, Don. And thanks also to Yvonne, who was the origin of this invitation. It really is great to be here, and particularly to acknowledge the substantial contributions that Highmark has made. Highmark has been in this business of obesity prevention and control from the very beginning. I was in Pittsburgh probably 8 years ago, at least, when Highmark's investment was just beginning. And today, I want to focus on where we are with respect to the epidemic and give you some suggestions of how we might prioritize and focus even more intensively on strategies that are going to make a difference. We're in an interesting phase of the obesity epidemic. When I started at CDC, the issue was recognition. And many of you have seen the state maps that's showing the spread of the obesity epidemic in adults. That was really, I think, a key moment or a key piece of material in changing the perception of obesity as from an individual problem to a population-based problem. We were then challenged with the development of targets for obesity prevention. I'll share those with you in a few moments. And immediately following those targets was the development of strategies at the state and community level. And now I think we're in a position to begin to intensify and prioritize those strategies. And we really are, I believe, at a turning point with respect to this epidemic. We may, and some of the data I will show you suggest we may be slightly turning the corner. So if we begin with where we are, these are data from the Pediatric Nutrition Surveillance System. Dr. Sebelius acknowledged or recognized this system, and the latest data from this system suggests that there are decreases in the prevalence of obesity in 18 states and territories. Now, you can see here that, along the bottom that the prevalence in most of the significant ethnic groups in this country has been flat. There's been no significant increase over this 10-year period, with one exception, and that is American Indians, Alaskan Natives. When we look nationally, actually, I should say these are 2 to 5-year-olds, basically, and they're lower-income children, predominantly in the WIC population. When we look at trends in obesity in youth, and this is 6 to 19-year-olds, the prevalence in girls has also been flat. But the prevalence in boys, as this slide indicates, has continued to increase about 4% over, again, this 11-year period. And what's important about these data is if we remove African-American boys from this analysis, the prevalence in boys is also flat. So this is the first indication that the disparities in obesity may be beginning to drive these increases. The other hopeful sign is some data that the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation published a couple of months ago, which show that there have been significant decreases in the prevalence of obesity in a number of states and communities, in California, in New Mexico, in Mississippi, and West Virginia, and a number of cities, other cities around the country. But there are two important perspectives associated with these data. The first is that in those places, with 1 or 2 exceptions, where obesity, the prevalence of obesity is decreasing, those decreases are predominantly in the white population, suggesting that the disparities are actually widening because there's no decrease in African American or Mexican American populations. And secondly, this is no cause for complacency. There's still a prevalence of obesity nationally of 17%. And what I'm going to share with you today is that we need to invest much more heavily in prevention and treatment. And I'm not going to talk very much about treatment, but some of the data I'll show you, I think, will point to the need for that. Beginning with this slide. Despite the improvements and plateaus in childhood obesity per se, severe obesity, defined here as a BMI greater than 120% of the 95th percentile, is continuing to increase. And the implications of these increases are of concern because severe obesity is much more likely to persist into adulthood. In fact, there are estimates that 50% of severely obese adults, that is with a BMI over 40, had onset of their obesity in childhood and it persisted. And furthermore, the costs of severe obesity in adults are a major driver of the medical costs that we're seeing associated with obesity. In adults, 40% of the costs of adult obesity are associated with 8% of patients. Those are patients with BMIs of 35 or greater. Now, this is what's happening in Pennsylvania. Remember I said that the Pediatric Nutrition Surveillance System, the survey of low-income children, is showing decreases in 18 states. Pennsylvania is not one of those. In fact, Pennsylvania is one of those states, one of 3 states, in which there has been a significant increase in the prevalence of obesity over this period of time. And the data in children and adolescents is also not compelling. For example, we're seeing a plateau in overweight and obesity among K through 6th graders. But this decrease that you see among the obese individuals in grades 7 through 12, I'm not sure is real. I looked at the state data. I don't have earlier data to compare it to, but one would expect if there's a true decrease in the prevalence of obesity in 7th to 12th graders, that would see a corresponding increase in the prevalence of overweight. So these data, although perhaps promising, leave me uncertain about what's really going on. Now, I said earlier that the costs of severe obesity are driven by people in the above people with BMIs above 35, but the overall costs of obesity to our population are themselves substantial. These are data that we published a couple of years ago, which suggested that the total costs of obesity were about $150 billion a year, or 10% of the national healthcare budget. These are likely underestimates, and there have been several publications since we published these data that suggest that the costs are actually considerably higher. The other point here is that these are only direct costs of diseases associated with obesity, and you know what those are: type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and cancer, and absenteeism, but they do not include the costs of underperformance at work, which is, by some estimates, at least as much as the direct costs of obesity. Now, how can we explain where we are now? What really accounts for these shifts? Well, I think that these data from tobacco are quite helpful in providing some insight as to why we might be at a plateau. You can see here that the per capita cigarette consumption began in 1900 and accelerated along a pretty constant slope up until the 1950s, when the first reports linking smoking and cancer began to appear. The tobacco use peaked in 1964, interestingly enough, at the time of the first Surgeon General's report on smoking and health, and then plateaued for 10 or 15 years before a variety of policy and environmental initiatives began to kick in. Enforcement of the restrictions on tobacco use or tobacco purchases by adolescents, more information appearing on the adverse effects of tobacco, a number of states and communities beginning to institute these types of strategies, the ban in smoking from public buildings. The important lesson here is that plateau in tobacco use began with an increased awareness of the adverse effects of tobacco. And I believe that's one of the factors that has contributed to the plateau in childhood obesity, and for that matter, adult obesity, that people have become aware of the adverse effects of obesity and have begun to make behavioral changes that I'll share with you in a moment, because there are data to support modest changes in behavior. But the other important insight here, and this will relate to my closing comments, is that the control of tobacco reflected and reflects a social movement. And this movement didn't begin at the federal level. This movement began at the state and community level. And the learnings, the successes, the strategies that began in one community were shared with other communities and spread across the country. And the efforts of the tobacco companies to control the negative responses to tobacco quickly fizzled out against the brush fire of changes that were occurring across the country. I think the same thing can be said of the civil rights issue. The same thing can be said of Mothers Against Drunk Driving, that these movements began at the local level and state level, not at the federal level. And as you'll see, there are some contrasts with where we are with respect to obesity, because there's been an enormous effort on the part of this administration, the Obama administration, to institute a variety of strategies to begin to control obesity. Now, where do we focus? What is an appropriate target for our efforts? Well, these data that were published in the New England Journal from the Harvard School of Public Health, I think, are instructive in terms of looking at what kinds of changes in food consumption were associated with changes in body weight. And you can see at the top of this graph that increases in the consumption of unprocessed meats or processed meats, sugar drinks, fries, chips, and refined grains were associated with weight increases over a 12 to 20-year period. These are data from the Health Professionals Study or the Nurses' Health Study. Whereas increases in whole grain consumption, fruits and vegetable consumptions were associated with weight decreases. So these begin to provide a research underpinning for the kinds of nutritional targets on which we should focus our efforts. And just to give you a sense of what a challenge this is going to be, there's an important study conducted by Nestle called the Feeding Infants and Toddlers Study, which shows just how far we have to go in our youngest population. So that, for example, in this study, a third of children ate no vegetables on the survey day. Another third ate no fruits on the survey day. Another third consumed a sugared breakfast cereal on the survey day. And another third consumed sugar drinks. There was some overlap in those populations, but in the 2 to 4 year old population, these dietary changes are in absolute contrast with what we should be targeting. Now, there's another important paper that I think should guide our thinking about obesity, and that's this paper published by Claire Wang about a year ago in the American Journal of Preventive Medicine. And Claire looked at the deficit necessary to return the mean BMI, the average BMI, in children and adolescents back to where it was in the 1970s. That was a prevalence of about 5%. And you can see that these deficits are quite small on a daily basis. 33 calories in 2 to 5 year olds, 150 in 6 to 11 year olds, and 180 in 12 to 19 year olds. Now, these are daily caloric deficits. They need to be in place for a long period of time, the next 7 years. But the point here is that these are achievable deficits. And I'm going to share with you in a few minutes where some of our current strategies come in terms of meeting this need. Now, coming back to the story of CDC's engagement in terms of first establishing the importance of this problem through the obesity maps, the next thing that we were challenged with doing was to develop the targets for obesity prevention and control. This was in about 2001, and we really didn't have much of an evidence base for the targets we picked. And this slide, from when you look at reduce energy intake on down, were the target behaviors that we thought were quite appropriate for obesity prevention and control. Since then, we've added pregnancy because we know that pre-pregnant weight gain during pregnancy, diabetes during pregnancy, and interestingly enough, tobacco use during pregnancy are all associated with early childhood obesity. We don't actually know the caloric costs of these strategies, so that, for example, it's hard to put a caloric cost on increased sleep or reduced sleep in terms of what it does to obesity. But we do have some idea of what the energy costs of these other areas should be. And most recently, I've been thinking, as I said, about how one fixes a caloric cost with a specific policy initiative. And when you look at these strategies around reduced energy intake, I become a bit of a heretic because I don't know what the impact is on calorie consumption of fruit and vegetable intake. I don't know what the calorie cost is of putting a supermarket in an underserved area. And I don't know what the caloric benefit is of improving community infrastructure. That doesn't mean that those things are not worth doing. It only means that it's hard to link those with obesity prevention and control. There are all sorts of other reasons to do so. One is just to improve dietary quality. Another is health equity. And many of these are perhaps preconditions for obesity prevention and control. But we're not going to see an immediate impact of these strategies. The other point that I think is well known to many of you in this room is that we need to move out from this individual focus of behavior change, which has the smallest population impact, out to the federal, state, and local policies that regulate healthy actions, and at those same things at the community level. And we need to think in terms of these terms that the clinical intervention, which I'm not discounting at all because that's where treatment of obesity resides. But as we move out, we need these population strategies are going to have a much greater impact. And we need to, as I keep saying, prioritize within those strategies. So there have been some positive changes and with respect to the population level dietary changes that I think help explain why we're at a plateau and why we may be beginning to turn the corner. So these are the major sources of excess caloric consumption in children and adolescents: sugar drinks, fast food, and pizza. Now, in these studies, the sugar drinks are the total daily caloric intake, unadjusted for usual intake, whereas the fast food and pizza figures that I'm showing you here are the caloric additions to usual caloric intake. In other words, if you, in terms of a 12 to 19-year-olds, on the day that 12 to 19-year-old has fast food, they overconsume 300 calories in excess of what they would usually consume. Pizza is the same thing. Now, the changes, interestingly enough, that have occurred over a substantial period of time, almost that same 10-year period encompassed by the plateau, have been consistent with reductions in the targeted areas of food consumption that were problematic, as shown in the Harvard School of Public Health studies. So sugar drinks have declined about 70 calories in children and adolescents, about 45 calories in adults. Fast food consumption has decreased by about 70 calories in 2 to 11-year-olds, somewhat less in 12 to 19-year-olds. These, again, think about that 30, 150, 180 calories. These are starting to have an impact on daily caloric balance. These changes have also been accompanied, interestingly enough, by changes in the food supply in the United States. So this is a study by Hank Cardello and his colleague Wolfson, showing the change in sales over a 5-year period in the companies that are members of the Healthy Weight Commitment Foundation. This is a group of companies that agreed to reduce the calories in the U.S. food supply by 25% by 2015. If you work that out, that's about 10 calories per capita. And part of the reason that food consumption may change may be attributable to that investment in reducing the caloric content of foods. And you can see here that companies that have improved their food quality are selling more of those products. That 80% of the growth in sales of companies belonging to the Healthy Weight Commitment Foundation have been healthier foods and beverages. And those now account for 50% of sales. So there's now this trend in the population which may be underpinning the kinds of changes in caloric consumption that we saw in the earlier data. The other place where changes that are not as dramatic are occurring, but are beginning to occur, is in restaurant chains. And you can see here that the sales of healthier foods and beverages, and both food or beverages seen separately, are increasing more rapidly in restaurant chains than the less healthful products. So now we have a plateau and maybe modest decreases in the prevalence of childhood obesity, paralleled by changes, modest changes in food consumption, particularly of those high caloric density items like sugar drinks and fast food, and changes in the production of these foods. That is cause for hope. Again, we may be at that corner, we may be slightly turning that corner. These changes have to persist. At the same time that these changes are going on, there are a number of other important federal efforts that are either in place or underway to shift food consumption in the United States. I mentioned the Healthy Weight Commitment Foundation. Some preliminary estimates on their part suggest that in contrast to the 10 calories per capita decrease, they may be actually at a higher level in terms of decreasing those calories in the food supply. Menu labeling is coming into place through the Affordable Care Act. It's not yet in place in a lot of states and communities, and there's some contradictory data as to whether that's going to actually change consumption. It may, in fact, change the formulation of foods, and there's some notable examples where that has already occurred, where the high calories in certain foods, for example, sold at Starbucks, have been shifted to lower the caloric content. Front-of-pack labeling is something else that's under consideration by the FDA. Industry has already implemented a front-of-pack labeling that doesn't really, in my view, enhance the choices that people make, because the information is still confusing. And I hope that the front-of-pack labeling that emerges from the FDA will code foods and the content of those foods as red, yellow, and green, rather than just giving a percentage of daily caloric intake. The Healthy Hunger-Free Kids Act has already changed the foods available in schools. And right behind that is the competitive food policy announced about a month ago by the USDA, which sets very important and critical standards on the foods that are sold in competition with the school lunch. That is also likely to make a significant difference. And underway at USDA are considerations for how to change the Child and Adult Care Food Program, CACFP, which supplies foods to early care and education centers, and is likely to have an impact that is similar to the impact of the Healthy Hunger-Free Kids Act and the competitive foods in schools. So these are initiatives that are likely to continue the trends that we've already seen. Now, what can we expect in terms of the impact of these programs? Well, these are also data from Claire Wong, who I mentioned earlier, in terms of calculating the caloric deficit. And these are data that were just published in the American Journal of Preventive Medicine a month ago, in which she used and has online a caloric calculator to begin to assess the impact of specific policy initiatives on the caloric deficits associated with those initiatives. You can see here that beverages are a pretty good investment, that if we eliminate juice in early care and education, we save 70 calories, and that's just a shift from juice to water, for example. Or if we move from whole milk to low-fat milk, another 70 calories. There have been some data that show that when water is substituted in after-school programs for juice, there's a 60-calorie reduction in usual intake. And notice that the excise tax on sugar drinks, by comparison, is a lower impact, but perhaps a more sustained one, and one which certainly has implications for revenue. The food standards, before the competitive foods came out, the California standards for competitive foods were the closest to the national standards. When those are implemented in California, that's an 80-calorie savings, which may account for the fact that California was one of those states which saw a reduction in the prevalence of obesity. The CFBAI is a voluntary industry group, and they have instituted standards for foods marketed to children. That has a modest impact if it changes the consumption of sugared breakfast cereals. But notice that akin and like that earlier slide that I showed you, decreases in fast food consumption account for 125 to 310 calories on the day that food is consumed. Now, fast food consumption is obviously not something that adolescents or children consume every day. So at the population level, this is going to have a smaller impact. The average consumption of fast food in children and adolescents is about once every 5 days. But still, on a population level, if you divide these numbers by 5, it's still a 25 to 60 calorie difference on a population level as opposed to an individual level. So these are calorie. These are where we're going to achieve differences when we change beverage and food consumption. We can see similar shifts if we are able to increase physical activity. So enhanced physical education, again, these are Claire's estimates, seems to have a pretty modest effect. Part of the reason that this is low is that kids are only in school 180 days of the year. So if you average the impact of quality PE over that time period, it's a smaller contribution. And the same is true for increases in physical education time. If you add 15-minute classroom breaks for physical activity, it's about 11 to 25 calories per day, depending on the size of the child. Safe routes to school, again, is 9 to 17 calories. Now, it's important here to qualify that, again, these are population-level estimates. So not every child, and they're adjusted for that 180 days a year in school. The safe routes to school is adjusted for the children who can actually live within a mile of school and therefore walk to school. And then there's been another study by Bassett which shows that these are that the estimates are about twice this, and that he's shown that the best investments are physical education time, which you can see here, and classroom breaks for physical activity or active recess. So when we target schools, not only do we have to continue to focus on the implementation of the Healthy Hunger Free Kids Act and the Competitive Foods Act, but these are the areas on which we should focus in terms of physical activity. There are two more points that need to be made here about physical activity. The expectation is that increases in physical activity will treat obesity. In fact, the major impact of physical activity is on the comorbidities associated with obesity. It doesn't help a lot in weight loss, although it's terribly important in weight maintenance. But in terms of comorbidities, if you are overweight, have increased blood pressure and are inactive and become active, your blood pressure will improve. The same thing is true for lipid levels. The same thing is true for glucose tolerance. So physical activity is a strategy that we should be promoting, not just to prevent obesity, not just to sustain weight loss after it occurs, but also to prevent or reduce the comorbidities associated with obesity. The other point about these caloric deficits, which I think is not widely understood, is that only about a third of the change in weight associated either with a caloric increase or caloric deficit occurs in the first year of implementation because of adjustments in metabolic rate. That metabolic rate goes up when you gain weight, goes down when you lose weight. And in the prevailing notion, well, if you eat 3,500 calories less, you're going to lose a pound. That is really an urban myth because only about a third of that, half of that weight loss associated with a 3,500 calorie deficit will occur in the first year. It takes 3 years for that deficit to be implemented. So as we think about these strategies, we have to consider not only the time it takes for that weight change to occur, but the impact of whatever strategy it is that we're implementing in terms of the caloric impact of those deficits. Now, from the institutional point of view, there are a number of other overriding strategies to achieve a better weight outcome. One of the first of these is baby-friendly hospitals. These are hospitals which have implemented a variety of strategies shown on this slide, like modeling breastfeeding practices, staff competency, breastfeeding education, early initiation, skin-to-skin contact. These types of strategies are all associated with reductions in childhood obesity. And these are institutional strategies that changes in maternity care to promote breastfeeding are likely to have a substantial impact on the prevalence of obesity. A second and third overarching strategy are state and district school policies related to competitive foods. There's been a really nice study published by Jamie Tricky out of the University of Illinois Chicago campus, which shows that a variety of implementation of a variety of state and school district policies related to competitive foods is associated with reduced weights in those states where these policies are implemented. It's hard to attach a caloric cost to these, but as a general strategy, a focus at the state and district level in terms of competitive foods is likely to have an impact. The Alliance for a Healthier Generation, Healthy Schools policy is also likely to have an impact. There's an evaluation of that program which has just been funded, and I know that Highmark has been an important partner in Pennsylvania with this alliance. And the hope is that from moving from an intensive, individually mediated intervention within schools to an internet-based intervention may be very cost beneficial. Another area which has received less attention, but is likely to have an impact on calories, is the Childhood Obesity 180 Healthy Kids Out of School policies. This is a group that I've been part of that's been operating now for about 2 years, focused on what industry and the private sector and the public sector can do together. And one of our first programs was this Healthy Kids Out of School program, which focused on 3 strategies: drink right, snack smart, and move more. And these are the organizations which have signed on to these strategies: Pop Warner Football, the Y, the National Urban League, National Council of La Raza, 4-H Club, Boy Scouts, Healthy Kids Out of School, Girl Scouts, Youth Soccer, and the National Council of Youth Sports. Now, this agreement has been made at the national level with the CEOs of this organization. But this is something that you can do in your community, because my guess is that all of you are touched by one of these programs. And implementing these 3 strategies, that substituting water for sugar drinks, fruits and vegetable snacks for high caloric density snacks, and keeping kids moving, are very consistent strategies that these groups ought to be able to implement. And this is beyond the participation in sports. This is something that is clearly going to have an impact on health. And the reach of these organizations is about 17 million children and adolescents across the country. So the implementation of these strategies may be as effective as any of those that I showed you in terms of the caloric cost. Early care and education deserves special attention. You'll remember that the daily caloric deficit necessary to achieve reduction in mean BMI by 2020 was only 30 calories a day. And the importance of early care and education is that it affects large numbers of young children in the country. 70% of children 3 to 5 years of age were in at least one weekly care arrangement. And 40% of preschoolers are in childcare for 35 or more hours per week. This is a captive audience. This is a group that is subject and likely to be responsive to regulatory efforts or interventional efforts changing what happens in early care and education, both with respect to physical activity and food consumption. And the Let's Move Child Care Challenge provides model types of initiatives that could be implemented. So an hour or 2 hours of physical activity a day, including outdoor play, because we know that children who are outdoors are much more active than children who are indoors. Limiting screen time to 30 minutes per week during childcare. This doesn't mean 30 minutes per week overall, but it recognizes that children are going to get a lot more exposure to media at home than they necessarily do in early care and education. fruits and vegetables at every meal, no fried meals, no fried foods. And notice the beverage policy, and remember that that was about 70 calories if you eliminate juice, another 70 calories if you move from whole milk to low-fat milk, and support for breastfeeding from others during the child care day. So the implementation of these strategies is likely to have a major impact on the weights of those children. It's not going to make them malnourished, but it will, I think, help prevent or even reduce obesity among those children who are at risk. Now, in closing, what's it going to take to create the kind of cultural change that we saw with Mothers Against Drunk Driving or the Civil Rights Movement or tobacco use? These are elements common to social movements. And it begins with a shared and personalized perception of a threat. Now, despite the fact that a recent poll, actually a poll that was released 2 days ago, showed that 85% of American adults thought that obesity was the #1 health problem, this is not something that they necessarily incorporate or apply to themselves. This is somebody else's problem. And that's particularly true of their children. Because I think it relates to the term obesity, which is a pejorative term, not perceived as a medical term. And so people and parents don't perceive childhood obesity as a threat necessarily to their children. And until that happens, until the population of parents believes that that the current practices in schools to avoid physical activity is a threat, or the lack of community investment in parks and recreational facilities is a threat, I'm not sure that this issue is going to be personalized in a way that begins to mobilize parents the way we've seen in other social movements. I think that we're seeing the beginning of a social network focused on collective action, that a number of communities, some funded by the CDC, namely the Community Transformation Grants, the Communities Putting Prevention to Work, the Robert Wood Johnson communities, the California Endowment communities, the communities funded by Kaiser Permanente, communities funded by Highmark, that these groups are beginning to mobilize around obesity. But part of the challenge here is the constituencies within those communities are often not united, so that the group that supports breastfeeding may not be the same group that supports increased fruit and vegetable intake or physical activity in schools. And I think part of the challenge here is what's the overriding initiative which is going to provide a broad grassroots investment. It may not be about obesity at all. It may be about healthy communities. It may be about social equity or social justice. But until we figure out what this is about, joining together the diverse groups that need to invest in this effort is going to be a challenge. And that's what's going to be needed to connect these groups across communities and lead to the kind of shared innovation and the sharing of innovation that characterize the other movements that I mentioned, tobacco, civil rights, and Mothers Against Drunk Driving. There are at least some of these conditions that for collective success, this is kind of a modification of the last slide. The highest order of business is a common agenda. But in order to begin to assess our progress, we need shared measurement systems. And activities of one group need to reinforce those of another. And we need to think about co-benefits of obesity prevention that join one group with another. And Catherine Ross last night talked about transportation. This is an important area because, as she pointed out, the transportation authorities don't necessarily see their mission as health. But joining health to their mission gives that an extra boost. And thinking about how to promote public transit or bicycle lanes or walking to school is a co-benefit, and we can bring health to that discussion. Another important principle that I think has been given limited consideration is what's called the triple bottom line. That is strategies which have an environmental benefit, a health benefit, and an economic benefit. And there's some examples of that around, so that, for example, in Lansing, Michigan, which was well in front of the foreclosure crisis, and there were lots of condemned housing. The city took over that housing, raised it, and made community gardens, which had the added benefit of bringing people out of their homes to garden, which mobilized those communities to get rid of the drug dealers that were occupying some of those houses. That's a triple bottom line that had an environmental benefit in terms of making the neighborhood safer. It probably increased the tax base in the surround, and it had a health benefit to the extent that those fruits and vegetables that people were growing improved their diet. Continuing communication is important. Anybody who in this room who's part of a coalition knows how important that is, that there needs to be an ongoing dialogue about these strategies. And finally, as Highmark has so nicely provided, there needs to be backbone support for ongoing actions. That funding can be modest at a level, but there needs to be some core that plans the meetings, that organizes the agenda and convenes. And finally, a few other keys to building a social movement. The success and the likelihood that an individual will join a movement is directly proportional to their expectation that this is going to succeed. The bigger that movement becomes, the more likely it is that people will join in. And this affects the choice of strategies. What are those strategies which are going to mobilize the largest number of individuals? I think we have not done a terrific job in terms of educating the public about the consequences of obesity and its costs. There is often a disconnect between people's concern about type 2 diabetes and the recognition that obesity is one of the leading contributors to type 2 diabetes. We need to do a better job in making that case and be clearer about what the benefit of our strategies are. And again, saying that this is an obesity prevention strategy, that a given policy is an obesity prevention strategy, may not be as powerful as an argument that this particular policy improves the quality of life for all sorts of different people in a community. If change is inevitable, corporate and government interventions and partnerships are going to be much easier to achieve. Again, the analogy is in tobacco, where the number of communities and states that were actively moving in tobacco prevention and control was a deterrent to ongoing efforts of the tobacco industry to reverse that. And I think a similar strategy is beginning to emerge with regard to sugar drink consumption. What we do needs to be transparent. We need to make clear why it is that we think a given policy is genuine and is going to make a difference. Otherwise, we're going to fail. And finally, we need to be much more opportunistic. We need to capitalize on natural experiments. We need to capitalize on efforts or surprising occasions and highlight those as opportunities for change. So as I said at the beginning, I think we are beginning to turn the corner on the obesity epidemic. I think we need to be much more strategic about the choice of policies, and we need to think in terms of not only their caloric impact, but the reach that they have. How many people are going to be affected by our choice of policy? And I think we can use the caloric costs of those policies as the initial step to prioritization, but then right behind that is the feasibility of that and the ability of any given policy to bring other groups to the table to form a coalition which will take those forward. The local efforts are enhanced by the federal policies that we've had in place, the Healthy Hunger Free Kids Act, competitive foods, and clearly followed by CACFP. We're underinvested in physical activity, which is a key strategy, and which is still characterized by groups which are not yet united around a strategic direction or a set of policy steps. And finally, although I think we can say that there may be a nascent social movement around obesity prevention and control, we need to be much more effective at mobilizing broad grassroots support and think strategically about whether this is about obesity prevention and control or whether it's about quality of life for our children, healthy children, community wellness, and community development. So again, I'd like to acknowledge Highmark's contribution in this area, which has been extraordinary, and thank you for your attention. I'm happy to answer some questions.
Good morning, thank you. I just didn't understand one thing. It was very interesting to me as a physician. You were talking about the 3,500 calories deficit to lose a pound, and you said it takes 3 years for that deficit to catch up. To what do you attribute that lag time?
The last part of your question was what?
To what do you attribute that lag time? Like
Oh.
if you lose a pound, why are you saying it happens
So
3
what
years
happens,
later?
what happens both on the way up with respect to weight and the way down with respect to weight, as you gain weight, your caloric expenditure increases. So it neutralizes some of that weight gain. The same thing is true going down. As you lose weight, your metabolic rate decreases and your activity may decrease. So you have to adjust for that shift, which has not been incorporated into the previous estimates of what the impact of any caloric excess or deficit would be. Yes.
Do you think the metric that we're using for measuring obesity in children may be underestimating the sense of the problem when you're using 95th percentile? And in fact, if you do that with adults, you get to a very, very different set of metrics in terms of how you define obesity.
Yeah. I think that the BMI is a good indicator of fat with children and adolescents over the 95th percentile. We know that weight increases in that group is associated with increases in body fat. In the 85th to 95th percentile, just as in a BMI between 25 and 29.9 in adults, there's a lot of misclassification. That about half of those individuals are overweight but not over fat. And below the 85th percentile, the relationship of BMI to percent body fat is not, it's hardly significant. So I don't think the BMI is a good indicator below the 85th percentile. It's problematic between the 85th and 95th percentile, but I think it's a good indicator for obesity at above the 95th percentile.
Thank you very much for your talk. I enjoyed it. Pennsylvania has the second largest rural population in the United States. Could you please comment about pediatric obesity and the rural situation, and do we need to have different approaches towards dealing with the rural population?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that the rural populations have been neglected and that the strategies that I articulated are much more appropriate for urban or suburban populations. But I think that the existence of, or the problem of obesity in rural populations points much more to the need to change the institutions in which those children are found. I think the strategies within early care and education, the strategies within schools all pertain, and as well as the after-school strategies. But I have to confess that we know very little about the implementation of those strategies. Bill Neal, who's here, has been quite effective in West Virginia in terms of changing the prevalence of obesity. And I think that's in part, I'd be interested to know, and maybe Bill can comment, whether they have data that distinguishes changes in the prevalence of obesity in their rural versus their urban populations. Bill, do you want to comment on that? Behind you.
Actually, Bill, we don't have much data comparing rural and urban because so much of West Virginia, 85% is rural, and even our urban populations are not like Pittsburgh-size urban populations. So what we have seen is that a modest decrease in obesity among our second grade children that we screen, and we do screen statewide. Kind of a leveling off over the years among our fifth grade students, but encouraging to us is the fact that hypertension has decreased among fifth grade students. We do comprehensive screening, including BMI, fasting lipid profile, blood pressure, and so forth on these fifth graders. And hypertension has decreased about 3.5% over the last several years. Our hope is, even though BMI has not changed significantly, and our hope is that this is the beginning, that in a year or two or three we will begin to see some BMI decline among that group, and that hypertension, as you pointed out, the comorbidities that go with obesity and extreme obesity are relevant. So I'm encouraged by that. But my colleagues in the College of Physical Activity and Sports Science at WVU, I think, are doing an awful lot to increase in any way we can the participation in physical activity, active academics within the school environment, during the school classroom day, a statewide physical activity plan, because what we recognize, the things that you noted with regard to improved nutrition within the school environment in particular, that's kicked in over the last few years, and that's having some impact. But we've not seen real impact yet with regard to physical activity, but we're really concentrating on that.
Yeah, as I said before, I think that the major challenge in physical activity is that there are maybe a dozen different groups at the national level which are invested in physical activity. We've got great recommendations from Educating the Student Body, a recent report on the IOM, which fit with the mid-course review of the physical activity guidelines for Americans. What we lack is a how to implement those strategies. And in my view, this characterizes much of the field, that we know what we should be doing. What we don't know is quite how to do it. And that's an opportunity for case studies, for learnings that can be transferred across communities of interest. Thank you, Bill, for that comment.
Yes, good morning. Could you elaborate on some of the competitive food initiatives that are going on that have been effective?
Well, the most important initiative is the federal competitive food standards, which were released. My sense of time is warped now. I think I was going to say a month, but I think it's been more like 2 months ago. And you can go on the USDA website and see those standards, but they not only affect calorie levels, but they also affect nutrient levels like sodium, and set goals for the foods that are served in competition in schools that need to be in place by, I think the initial goal is by 2015, I may be mistaken in that, and then fully implemented by 2020. I think there's some interim goals and then full implementation. And I think those are likely to have as substantial an impact on those foods in schools as the Healthy Hunger Free Kids Act. Yes.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. I wanted to ask 2 questions, I think. The first is in response to all of the strategies that you've put forward, which I think every person in this room would agree are completely appropriate strategies. What I wanted to ask was, I think one of the challenges is this major cultural shift that doesn't seem to have happened or is not happening on very local levels, but also on national levels. So for example, one of the organizations, Girl Scouts, that was in support of, putting health forward, the first thing that comes to my mind is Girl Scout cookies. Another smaller issue.
I should mention that was put aside when we were negotiating with...
That's what I figured. Another smaller example.
And by the way, Girl Scout, it's more important on what those Girl Scouts are doing on a week-to-week basis than on that one opportunity for sales.
I agree. It's just, it seems like there's a real struggle here to implement these kinds of strategies, competitive foods, for example. In our own school district, Pittsburgh Public Schools, yes, there are competitive food standards. However, there are very unhealthy foods by most people's definition that are sold at the same time as lunch that fit within the competitive food standards. And if any child buys more than one snack, well, forget it. So I'm just wondering, from a cultural shift perspective, what can we learn to actually be able to implement these strategies, and what do we need to still learn?
Well, I think what you're asking is how do we engage parents more directly in these issues? And I think that's a gap. That to date, these policy initiatives like the Healthy Hunger Free Kids Act, the competitive foods, have been federal. With this other initiative, often uncoordinated within communities, like the CPPW or CTG communities funded by CDC, which have not necessarily focused on the most strategic investments. And I think that's one of the challenges, is how do we mobilize parents around the issues that we think are going to make a difference so that they go to the schools and focus on these changes. Because even at the state level, there's very little state control over district school policy. And that means that in order to achieve implementation of those policies, or implementation for that matter in Girl Scout troops, that the efforts have to be local, that we have to figure out strategies that engage people. And they may not be obesity prevention strategies. They may just be good health. This is right for our kids. This is something we need to do. They're logy if they're having a high-fat diet on the school breakfast, or not able to concentrate because of lack thereof. So I think that I don't know that we can be prescriptive in that regard, because I think each community is likely to have a different expectation or investment in these strategies, and we have to go with whatever those are, making sure that they're not inappropriate, that they're going to reach a substantial proportion of the population, and that the impact in that population is going to be significant. Those are two strategies, dose dependent, that is impact and reach, that I don't think we've been as careful in thinking about as we've begun to invest in these obesity prevention strategies. Okay, one more question, I'm told.
Good morning, thank you. About a year ago, I had the opportunity to hear Dr. David Katz speak, thanks to the Highmark Foundation. And he spoke of his nutritional quality standard index for foods and packaging that we could look forward to seeing in the grocery store, for instance, at a scale of a 1 to 100, and 100 indicating the best food. Today, you mentioned hopes for seeing a stoplight strategy on packaging of foods. To my knowledge, I haven't seen either in this market, and just thinking about speaking a common language where everybody is on one page looking to a system for being able to identify healthy foods, and if there's multiple initiatives going on, if we're synchronizing those, and what we can look forward to locally to be able to interpret food labeling a little easier.
Mm-hmm. Well, the reason that you haven't seen the NuVal system that David Katz and others developed is that it's a proprietary system. I would have been much happier had David just granted this. And the other problem with NuVal is that the underpinnings for how those scores are developed is cloaked in mystery. There's a lot of concern about that. There are also a lot of other systems, the Hannaford 3-star system, for example, and other rating systems. The reason you haven't seen the front of pack labeling is that that's under the authority of the FDA. And there was a report on food labeling from the Institute of Medicine about 2 years ago. The FDA began to act on it, but there have been no recommendations yet forthcoming. But as I mentioned, the industry front of pack labeling was an effort to undermine whatever emerged eventually from the FDA. And as I said, I'm not sure that it's a really helpful system in terms of helping purchasers understand what it is that they're buying. So thank you very much.